And now, please welcome to the stage Roy Austin and our featured panelists.
Well, good morning, everyone. I said good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. There was a time when I would ask you guys to say good morning, and you guys would actually respond about 3 years ago when you thought I actually was somebody. I moved from the point in time where the only way I could get former Chief Surpass to talk to me was by threatening him with a consent decree, and now a free breakfast and he shows up. It's quite a change in times. So we have an absolutely amazing panel for you guys today, as you can see from the folks that we have up here. Let me very quickly introduce them, and then let's start digging into this very important conversation. So I'll start on the far end. So Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform. Next to him is Lewis Reed, who is the national organizer for Cut 50. Next to Lewis is DeRay McKesson, a civil rights activist and one of the first people on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri. Next to DeRay is Chief Chuck Ramsey, who's been the chief of pretty much every major city in the United States. Next to him, Professor Bruce Western, who's probably been a professor at most universities in the United States. Next to Bruce is Marissa Dodson, is Colette Peter,
Marissa.
the director of the Department of Corrections of Oregon. Next to Colette is Marissa Dodson, who is the public policy director of the Southern Center for Human Rights. And last but certainly not least is Alice Johnson, an activist, an author, and a clemency recipient. So let's start off. DeRay. Black people commit more crimes. Black people are more likely to be in jail. What's the problem with that?
Good morning, Roy. Haven't seen you in a while. It looks like we're starting off with a bang. We'll push and say that when we think about crime data, what we really have is arrest data. And when we think about arrests, we know that there's an overrepresentation of people of color who get arrested. So you think about New York City, 90% of the people who get arrested for smoking weed in New York City are black and brown. And y'all know that it's not just black and brown people in New York City smoking weed. So we're always sort of pushing people about how they think about what crime is actually happening in communities. And you think about things like white-collar crime, is that there's a new study that just came out from Oxford, and it shows that 36% of American households have been victims of white-collar crimes. You don't see any prosecutions, you don't see arrests happening at those. So we would say it's not clear that black people are actually committing more crime. It is clear that black people are being arrested for crimes in rates that are measurable and disproportionate. And what is interesting is that we see an overrepresentation. What we would say as activists is that the end of crime is actually the end of poverty and the end of addiction. So if you want to get rid of crime, end poverty, end addiction. The presence of police is only a way to incarceration, and we do actually see an overrepresentation of people of color with regard to poverty and with regard to addiction. And we will remind people that we actually have enough studies to make the big decisions. We don't need another study to say that poverty is not a good thing. We don't need another study to say that people shouldn't be in solitary confinement or that arresting people at rates doesn't actually change their behavior. Like, we don't need studies, but it's only with poor people and people of color that one is never enough to ask the questions. When one white girl went missing, we have Amber Alerts. When one thing happens with white communities, we do a whole host of systemic reforms. With black bodies, they have to pile up in droves for people to say oh, I think this is actually even a real problem in the first place. So I reject the premise.
DeRay, I'm sorry, but Chuck,
yes.
He just blamed the police.
He
said y'all are arresting everybody,
They
arresting black people.
And killing. I didn't talk about killing, but the police are killing people. I like Chuck Ramsey. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer, just for context.
So, Chuck, what's race have to do with policing?
Well, it has a lot to do with policing in our society in general. You can't ignore it. It's not as if that doesn't play a role. There's implicit bias in every aspect of our lives, and it has certainly impacted the police department. You know, I came on at a time when actually overt racism was not uncommon. I started in the Chicago Police Department, and at the time, in the late 60s, the huge experiment, if you will, in that department was actually teaming a black and white officer in a car together to see if they could actually work together as partners. They called them salt and pepper cars, by the way. The segregation within the department was real, you know? And so now what I see, you know, almost 50 years later, is more of an implicit bias, not so much overt racism, but it still has a negative impact on people, particularly poor people, people of color. And that's a difficult thing to really overcome. I think that we've allowed ourselves to stereotype people, particularly people that we think are more likely or more prone to be criminals. That not only deals with arrest, but also prosecution, also the courts in terms of sentencing. So it's not just police, it's the entire criminal justice system that needs to be reformed. It's not going to be an overnight fix, but then the community has to do something as well, DeRay, because victimization in many of our communities of color, and the victims are African American, the offenders are African American. We can't ignore that part of the equation either. So we have to deal with both sides if we really want to have a solution and not act as if it's just somebody else's problem and there's no reason for cops to be in a particular neighborhood or arrest particular people when the reality of crime on the street is right there.
You know,
Go
ahead.
There is no relationship between crime and police violence. So it is a myth to say that in communities where there's more violence, the police just must be present and therefore they are more violent towards community members, that there's absolutely no correlation between those two things. And I agree with you that like people can always make better choices, but it is sort of shocking when you think, again, a third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is killed by a police officer. That should tell us something about like a system being...
But you can manipulate stats any way you want. I just know for a fact, having worked in both Chicago, D.C., and Philadelphia, at the end of the year, when we look at the number of homicides, 80% of those homicides are going to be people of color. And I'm going to tell you right now, in 2020, even though we haven't gotten there, it'll be 80% next year, too. Yeah. So unless we deal with the real issues, and that includes poverty, education, and all those things, but let's not pretend as if we don't have a crime problem within many of our communities that have to be addressed. Now, how it's addressed is a different issue.
I'm just saying we got a crime problem in the police department, too, and Chicago PD is not a department to defend, you know?
Well, let me, hold on one second here, because I'm going to moderate this thing. Okay? I mean, I know they put me up here because I look good, but beyond that,
put us together. Why put us together like this?
So the other person DeRay attacked was Bruce.
I did not attack anybody.
And saying, we don't need another study, Bruce. Bruce, we have all the information we need. You academics are out there writing more stuff that we just don't need because we know all the answers, right?
We know a lot. I agree with DeRay in that respect. And I think one of the big questions we face is how can research inform policy? I think criminal justice policy has not been an area that's been strongly informed by research. It's often used very instrumentally, so people are trying to get to a conclusion, and research is used in that way. One thing I would say is that there are aspects of the criminal justice system that are very, very hard to penetrate. Prisons are often black boxes, and I think we need to know a lot more about prison conditions. I think the internal operations of police are often black boxes, and we have a lot to understand there. So understanding how implicit bias is affecting the internal operations of every day in police departments around the country. I think there's an enormous opportunity for research there, but it takes leadership in the part of corrections, on the part of police executives, to open themselves up and expose themselves to researchers and democratic accountability. Well, I think we should think of research as a form of democratic accountability.
Well, Bruce, stunningly, we have a corrections official here who just happens to run one of those black boxes, I guess. Colette, do you have any transparency in Oregon, or is it one of these black boxes?
No, I think we do have transparency in Oregon. I think when I came to the Department of Corrections in the early 2000s, I don't know that we did. I think we were very protective. We were just talking beforehand. We didn't open our doors to advocates or the ACLU or other organizations. And we began that work in 2004 and opening our doors and letting people come in. And it has been so instrumental to work with these individuals and say that we're going to open our doors, let them look at every corner of our organization, and then solve these problems in the boardroom, not in the courtroom. And we've made some great success happen with our mental health folks inside our institutions, working with organizations like Disability Rights Oregon to really come inside with the ACLU and work with us to make these places more humane and make our organization more transparent.
Marissa, you want to speak on this?
I actually want to speak to the comments around racism and policing and victims of crime, if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
So I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the intentional issues around racism and oppression in our system. We're talking about people like to say that our system is broken, that the kind of racial disparities that we see, we just kind of fell into them. Oops, I'm so sorry about how this happened. The system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. There are a lot of resources available to you if you don't believe that. I encourage you to read books like Slavery by Another Name, New Jim Crow. The intentional effort to put people of color into slavery, a new form of slavery after the 13th Amendment is real. And so I think that when we're thinking about the outcomes of this system in terms of the likelihood of a black person being stopped, a black person is 7 times more likely to be stopped, searched, detained, more likely to be denied bail, more likely to get a longer sentence. I mean, at every aspect of our system, African Americans are more likely to be treated with a more negative outcome. Yet, African Americans are less likely to actually have weapons or guns on us when we are searched. So I want to just get rid of this notion that, you know, we have to police black communities the way we are because this is where crime is and this is where it's going. Drug use, drug sale is the same by race. It's just about prosecution. When we're thinking about what the victims of crime, particularly violent crime, want to see, and there's been some polling on this, and I'm happy to talk about this when we get to public support, but these are the same communities, and what they're asking for is the same things that we are asking for shorter sentences, for investments in education, investments in affordable housing, investments in the lives and communities that we're talking about. So I don't think this is an either or, but I do think that this conversation around how we are policing, how folks are encountering the criminal justice system, I mean, we could go on and on about sentencing and parole, but if we're not really dealing with the likelihood of being stopped and what happens with that encounter, and you could make your police force, your prosecutor office, your bench as black as you want it to be, I also encourage you to read Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr., because this is not about just having more black officers, about having more black prosecutors. These things are baked into our system in ways that continue to negatively impact people of color in this country, and we just cannot ignore that.
Well, look. Chuck, I want to give you 30 seconds to respond to that, because as I understood what she was saying, she's saying it's not about who's committing the crime or who has the weapons. It's a conscious decision to go after people of color.
Well, I would argue that it's not a conscious decision to just go after people of color, but when you are dealing with crime and you're deploying resources and you've got robberies, rapes, and shootings, and gang activity, and things like that going on, I mean, where would you deploy your resources? And so that's part of the dilemma. I mean, listen, in case you haven't noticed, I mean, I'm African American too, so I'm not just saying that, you know, all black people are bad. I saw my first homicide when I was 14 years old when my brother's best friend was murdered by a gang member because he wouldn't join a gang. So, I mean, I've lived the violence that occurs in our communities. We have to deal with it from both sides. Police need to do the job without taking into account race, okay? I realize that's, you know, ways to get there. But the community has to also take responsibility for some of the actions and stuff that goes on in the community as well. We have to learn to police ourselves, not wait to be policed by somebody else.
So, now that we've solved the racism issue in the criminal justice system, let's move on to a different topic. Alice, there's been a movement lately to switch the language that we use for people who were incarcerated. Why does this matter?
It's very, very important. I think that it is humanizing the whole issue of those who are incarcerated. I can tell you from firsthand experience that every time that I speak, every time that I'm on a platform, every time that I'm engaging in community, and people hear or they see me, they're moved, because it's not just someone that you've read about. I'm not a statistic, I'm a human being. So all of the things that you're seeing now in how we're referred to as returning citizens, because that's who we are when we return back to our communities. We're not referred to as ex-cons, because to say that you're an ex-con means that you are still wearing that label of a convict. And when people see me, when they hear my story, when they see my family, it puts a whole different spin. It puts a different light on who we're incarcerating. I think that humanizing, bringing human stories, human faces, that is what moves the needle. Bringing our stories to the forefront, putting the formerly incarcerated at the table, giving us a seat at the table, seeing us takes that stereotype that has been placed on us. Just the fact that I was a grandmother, a great-grandmother, a mother, a sister, America was moved when they saw my release from prison. They saw my big family waiting there to embrace me. I was not a convict to them. I was a loved sister and mother and a family member that was being reunited with their families. So I think that it's very important to change the stereotypes, change the labels, change all of these names, because at the end of the day, I am your neighbor. I'm the one that's going to sit next to you at church. I'm going to be pushing the shopping cart in the grocery store next to you. My grandchildren are going to be in school with your children. You are going to interact with my family. So it's very, very important to recognize who we are, that we are not just a statistic or a number.
Thank you, Alice. Grover, what Alice just said is some liberal kumbaya. I mean, a name is a name. I've heard a number of people make it very clear that they're not planning on switching the language here. Coming from a different place politically, do these names matter at all?
Well, since most of the people who go to prison will be coming out again and living with everybody else, I think that the humanization issue has been important, and the movement to change occupational licensing law, where people restrict the ability to get certain jobs. Texas was training people to become barbers, and Texas had a law that said you couldn't be a barber and get a barber's license if you were an ex-con, if you're a felon. Those are the kind of laws we need to change, because these are people coming out of prison. They have families, and how well they're able to interact with them and stay involved in the community is going to affect how well they can do when they get back out of prison. So I think it's very important for people, if you try to solve the problem at all levels, to understand that there are people on every side of the table on this issue, on every issue.
Louis, thoughts on changing the language for purposes of humanization?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I've never seen a great-grandmother look as good as Miss Alice Marie Johnson, my very dear friend. So shout out, God has definitely been good to her. But at Cut 50, our theory of change is legislation through humanization. I served nearly 14 years in federal prison, and during the entire time by which I was in, I was referred to as an inmate. I was referred to as a body, and not necessarily as a person. Even though I am a father, even though I am a son, even though I am somebody's brother, and dare I say I'm somebody's baby daddy, right? I am someone who is a person. And so I think that ultimately, when you follow this thread, here's the thing. As a licensed clinician, I would never have a patient of mine come into my office and I'm writing a clinical note and saying that this crackhead, Marie, came into my office and thereby I treated her for X, Y, and Z. I would put the person before the issue. So when you follow the legislative thread, language influences perception, perception influences policy. Language influences perception, perception is going to influence policy. Let me say that again loud for the people in the back in the event if you didn't hear me. Language influences perception, perception is going to influence policy. So how we change our language about people is going to thereby influence our perception of those people. I personally believe, when somebody calls me an inmate, when somebody calls me an ex-con, especially when they do it from a spirit of just distaste, I look at that as a pejorative, and I also look at that virtually as somebody calling me a nigger, being a black man in America. So I'm grateful that we are having this conversation and we are raising the consciousness of people who may not necessarily have been impacted by the criminal justice system directly, so that we can be humanized and we can see, and so that society overall can see that we are your neighbors, we are your licensed clinicians, we are the people who are on panels who are giving our subject matter expertise and our scholarship to these particular issues.
Thank you, Louis. Let's switch topics a little bit here and talk a little bit about research. Colette, is the Oregon Department of Corrections evidence-based and fact-driven, the decisions that you make, and how so?
So in 2003, the Oregon legislature passed a bill that required all of our programs inside our institutions to be evidence-based. And so that really is a foundation that we have in Oregon. And I think if we're going to be really serious about humanization and normalization inside our prison walls, to do just that, to make these brothers and sisters and mothers and daughters of ours good neighbors again when they come back to our communities, we have to be very serious about looking at the evidence to support what we're doing. And to go back to the previous conversation around words matter, and we now have data and research to let us know that words matter. It's how we treat those individuals. And as we were talking about this in Oregon, I was speaking with a very good friend of mine, and she gave me this example. So anyone in the audience who's doubting that words matter, she asked me to shut my eyes and think of a person without a home. And then she said, now keep your eyes shut, and I want you to think of a homeless person. Now look at me. And if you saw the exact same person, you are either very enlightened or you're lying to me. And she was right. In the first scenario, I saw a mother with a baby on her hip. In the second scenario, I saw a man who was disheveled and a little scary. And so we're having very significant conversations in Oregon about words. This year, we passed a piece of legislation that actually struck the word inmate from statute.
So, Bruce, we're talking about criminal justice. We're talking about criminal justice reform. You're a professor. What works?
I think I think we're learning a lot over the last few decades. Crime has declined an enormous amount from the early 1990s. Homicide rates are half as high as what they were. Crime rates are down to 1960s levels.
But that's because we filled our prisons, right?
No. The research shows that the contribution of the rise in incarceration to the decline in crime has been very small. Maybe about 10% of the crime decline through the 90s and the early 2000s is due to increasing incarceration. And through the 1970s and 1980s, incarceration increased tremendously, and crime did as well. And there are a few key jurisdictions in which crime and incarceration have both declined significantly. And I think that evidence suggests that there are alternative strategies for public safety that don't depend on incarceration at all. What are they? I think evidence is emerging for community sources of public safety that lie outside of the criminal justice system. I want to stand with DeRay's observation that so much of the crime that comes into the criminal justice system is intimately linked to poverty and addiction, and I would add housing insecurity and homelessness too, and untreated mental illness are all key factors there. So there's a whole array of strategies that are focused on communities that lie outside of the criminal justice system, and that research evidence is in fields of public health, in social work. It lies out of the criminal justice policy conversation that we normally have. That works, I think, and that's what I think a more foundational reform would look like, and that's strongly evidence-based.
Grover, you want to speak on this?
Yeah, well, there are 50 states, there are 50 sets of laws, and they all have different institutions, even within those states. Are there studies that you look at, and you pointed a series of things you thought that mattered? 50 states have done them differently. Do you see crime going up in the 80s or down later because of differences between the states? Can you point to those, or is this a secular trend everywhere?
The crime decline was very, very broad, and so crime declined in cities, it declined in rural areas, it declined across the income distribution. It did go further in some places than others. I got to say, the causes of the crime decline is very actively debated among researchers. It's not like there's very strong research consensus. I will say that we also observed significant declines in crime in Western Europe as well over the same period. So the causes of decline may be generally common to advanced liberal democracies rather than specific to conditions in the United States. And I think a lot of the causes of the crime decline probably lie outside of public policy, private responses and adaptations to the conditions of community safety.
So, because he started policing from a stagecoach, I'm going to ask the technology question of Chuck Ramsey.
I have a smartphone. I do know how to do it.
Do you use TikTok?
No.
He's like, what is this?
Yeah, he's not as hip as he claimed. Chuck, how has technology improved policing? Has it improved policing, yes, or is policing more dangerous because of technology?
Well, technology has affected policing like it's affected all aspects of our life. I mean, I started at the time when obviously, we were still using real teletypes and things of that nature, and obviously things have changed a tremendous amount. When Lori Robinson and I co-chaired President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, one of the areas we focused on was technology. Now in 2014 and 15, the big deal in policing was body cameras. But what we wanted to do was stay away from talking about a specific type of technology and deal with the broader issue, because then it was body cameras, tomorrow it's going to be something else. So now we're talking about body cameras, we're talking about drones, we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about advances in DNA technology, all these kinds of things. So in my opinion, it's how we use the technology in policing that's really the important issue. There are legitimate constitutional issues that need to be addressed. There are legitimate privacy concerns that need to be addressed. It's easy to get into a database, it's not that easy to get out. And so we need to really think these things through. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. There needs to be ethics boards established where these things are debated before the technology is being presented and actually implemented and used out there in the public. So we have these kinds of open discussions. We need activists, we need civil rights attorneys, we need all the right people at the table to talk about this and provide some guidance, because right now we've got police departments across the country, they're buying technology, they're using technology, and I question whether or not they have policies in place that are such that can prevent or at least minimize the opportunity for any kind of abuse to take place. If we don't do it ourselves, the courts will do it for us. And so we need to really be mindful of that. Leverage technology, we need it. We really need it, but it has to be done properly.
Marissa, do you feel comfortable with all this technology? Do you feel safer? Do you feel like your rights are more protected because we are advancing technologically as fast as we are?
A little bit, maybe. So I think I could answer on both sides. The first thing I would say is, we were talking about this earlier in the green room, that there are some advances to technology that actually improve the system and make it easier for people to comply with conditions and make it easier or less oppressive for someone to be under correctional control. For example, there is voice ID technology that allows folks to, instead of having to figure out how many buses and lines it is to get to their probation officer, to be able to have a phone, get a phone call, say their name, the system recognizes their name, and then that's it. That makes that piece of their reporting requirement much easier. When I think about body cams, or the technology like the gunshot, hears the gunshot and deploys the police. I think that, the thing about it, and this is true in communities that are impacted by incarceration and crime, that people do not feel safe by police presence. That these tools, in terms of cameras and having body cameras, and we have all seen over the last few years several egregious murders take place on camera, yet there was no justice for the victims or their families. So in some ways, I think that we believe that some of these things will offer transparency and make it easier for us to assess the level of efficiency in our government, but we have a lot of reasons to believe that we should remain skeptical of efforts to improve law enforcement to the detriment, perhaps, of communities that are impacted.
Let's talk a little bit about declining crime. Bruce, you referenced this a little bit before. There was a little bit of a blip, as I recall, at the end of the Obama administration, where it appeared the crime may be going up, and someone used that to say that we were headed toward, I think it was, American carnage. What's the reality there? What really happened there?
Crime rates were very high through the 80s, the early 90s. Crime rates declined very, very substantially through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the first decade of the 2000s. And so we're in a world now in which crime rates are where they were in the 1960s, and it appears that the trends in violent crime have flattened out. And that means from year to year, sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes it's a little bit lower. Towards the end of the Obama administration, as you said, 2015, 2016, violent crime ticked up. The last 2 years, it's ticked back down. And I think this is probably the world that we're in at the moment. We've sustained very low crime rates now for nearly 2 decades. And with the current configuration of our institutions, I think from year to year, some years crime's going to go up, some years it's going to go down. And we know that...
So, sorry, Bruce, let me ask you this.
Yes.
Is this as low as we're going? Should we just accept right now that this is where crime is going to stay?
I think it's unacceptable. I think America is a violent society, and rates of homicide, for example, are far higher here than they are in Europe, and that should be unacceptable. So I think we need to deal with the problem of violence. And when I say violence, I want us to think about that in a really expansive way. And part of it is interpersonal violence that happens in communities, and that means in private households, domestic violence. It means street crime, but it also means the state violence of policing and incarceration, which also inflicts real harms. So I think the aspiration to be in a low violence society is as strong as ever. Things historically are relatively good, but we could do so much better.
Let me start with Lewis. Lewis, when I first met Van Jones, he promised to cut the incarceration rate by 50% in about 2-3 years. It hasn't happened yet.
I believe it's 10 years.
I maybe misheard.
Cut 50 in 10 years.
So,
unless you met him 8 years ago, but go ahead.
But let's talk about cut 50. Mm-hmm. We always talk about the nonviolent offender, the nonviolent person being released. But we can't do anything if we don't touch the person who's been convicted of something, a crime of violence. Mm-hmm. How do we get the American people around the idea that we are going to release, not sentence as harshly, a person who's convicted of a crime of violence?
Well, I think that there's definitely a level of sensitivity that has to come into place when you are dealing with a person who is the offender of a so-called violent crime and the survivor of such or families who have survived that incident. As an offender who has committed violent offenses and as someone who's actually been a victim of a violent offense, I have a deeper level of sensitivity than most. How do we get the public at large to understand that there should be sensitivity applied to this particular subject? One of three things. The first thing, I think that, and this is not a shameless plug, but I think that Van has done a great attempt at highlighting that issue through the Redemption Project. It highlights restorative justice. It takes people who have been impacted severely by the criminal justice system. In most cases, some people have lost their lives, they've lost their loved ones, etc., and it has paired them with those individuals who's been offenders of such crimes. And I won't tip the end of the episodes, but I think that what it does in the spirit of it is to show that both people will forever be inextricably tied to the worst day of each other's lives. That's from the offender side, and that's also from the victim side as well. The other thing is this. Statistically, and I went to alternative high school in an unaccredited college, so I don't have as much deep scholarship as the good professor over here. But what I will say is this. Statistically, people who have been convicted of violent offenses have a less likelihood to offend than those who are in that so-called nonviolent category. The other thing is this. I always tell people, I am not the worst thing that I have ever done in my life. In the United States of America, we discard recyclables appropriately. But when it comes to human potential, we like to dichotomize because it makes us feel good. These people are nonviolent offenders, and these people are violent offenders. And so where we do not discard recyclables, where we do discard recyclables appropriately, and we aren't as diligent and aren't as copious and aren't as sensitive when it comes to human potential, I think that we should really be looking in the mirror to say, you know something, I very well could be in that violent category if I took a drink and decided to drive and took someone's life. If, during an argument, I happened to, unfortunately, do something to someone that seriously injured them, and from a statute point of view, it put me in a violent category.
Okay, I want Alice to jump in and then Grover. Alice, should there be a dichotomy between violent and nonviolent when we're talking about clemency, when we're talking about early release? Should that exist?
First of all, I want to address some who are listed as violent offenders. There are those who have a violent offender charge that is in their sentencing who really committed no violence also. So I want to address also that group of people. There may have been a gun in the house. There may have been a gun in the car that was never discharged, didn't even belong to that person, but because they were in the house or in the car, they are listed as a violent offender. So it's not just violent crimes that are committed. It's the title, it's the label that you put on these offenders, that they are violent offenders. So I've seen pushback from people who were granted clemency, commutations, to say that you're releasing violent offenders out here, and they weren't really violent offenders. But to address what my friend just said here, is that I believe that there should be restorative justice. Once you have analyzed all of the factors, as to, is this person a safety risk to the community anymore? Has enough retribution taken place? Has enough rehabilitation also taken place? At that point, to continue to incarcerate someone after all of those factors have been looked at and have been satisfied, it's not justice at all. And I know this is going on something different, the sentences that are being handed out for both violent crimes, nonviolent crime. I was a first-time nonviolent offender. Went to trial, and I received life plus 25 years. I received more time than a violent offender because it was a drug crime. So you've got this whole big divide as to how much time is given out. And I'm a believer that the time should fit the crime. And the time did not fit the crime in my situation. And that is the first thing that you will hear some people say, is that if you do the crime, be prepared to do the time. But that time should also be fair and just based on the crime. And as I say, I'm a believer in restorative justice, but you must weigh all of those factors.
Okay, thank you. Grover.
Yeah. I think the distinction is between crime, violent crime, and nonviolent crime. The more important distinction is between crime and vices. And if somebody's buying and selling drugs, it may damage yourself, but it's not inflicting violence or force on anybody else. And so you have this situation where somebody goes to jail because of a possession of an inanimate object. And I think there are kind of three pots, not just one. There's violent crime, stabbing somebody. There's nonviolent crime, stealing a car when nobody's in it. And then there are victimless crimes, where somebody may hurt themselves, but they're not inflicting violence or stealing anything from anybody else. And as the country begins to move to end, we went through prohibition once with alcohol, and all of a sudden, spike of crime, people machine gunning each other. So when you punish vices as if they were crimes and tell somebody they've broken the law because they own an inanimate object like liquor or cocaine or a gun or a knife, you then actually, that TV show Breaking Bad, the guy was just selling a product. But because it was illegal, everybody gets shot. And so when you make victimless crimes, when you make vices into crimes and people with guns, the police come at you because you're not bothering anybody but yourself, people shoot back, all sorts of crime. The contracts to buy or sell drugs or liquor are only policed by violence, by Al Capone. I mean, he couldn't tell the guy, hey, you bought my liquor, now you owe me the money, because that's not a contract that you could keep, so the guns come out. So when you've got three different containers, violent crimes, nonviolent crimes, and victimless crimes or vices, it's only crime because the law says so, that becomes violence because it's a crime, not because of the object itself. And I think a lot of people are willing to say people shouldn't be in prison for victimless crimes, for vices, whether it's alcohol or drugs or having a knife in their pocket. And that has made a lot of people feel that people are in prison who haven't hurt anybody else. Why are you doing that? It's opened up a lot of the discussion. I do think there are three, not two, buckets.
Okay. Look, when I started doing criminal justice reform work close to 30 years ago, it was very uncool. Suddenly, it's the coolest thing in the world. Everybody wants to say that they're doing criminal justice reform. Marissa, what happened?
Yeah, imagine that. So, I mean, I think we could talk about race again, but I'll be brief. In terms of where the public was 25 or 30 years ago when it comes to appropriate responses to behavior, we, much more than we do now, believed in criminalizing poverty, criminalizing substance use, criminalizing mental illness. We believed in, lock them up, throw away the key. If they don't learn their lesson, lock them up some more. So we see kind of the support for our recidivist sentencing and our 2- and 3-strike laws. And now what we have in terms of a recognition for lots of reasons, including I do believe that the racial demographics of what substance use and addiction looks like today has really driven a different type of narrative when we're thinking about the face of someone who is addicted to a substance. And so all of that to say, today we know that folks are much more interested in things that work, that when you ask communities, particularly those that are impacted by incarceration, the victims of crimes, people that, kind of unlikely allies in this space, like people who voted for our current president, by and large believe that the criminal justice system is broken. There was a Pew poll that it's 70 to 80% of the people believe in sentencing reform, that we should be investing in, like I mentioned earlier, education and housing and kind of the things that get people in the system. I've often said that I've had a mentor who says that when every other system is broken, the net that catches is our criminal justice system. So until we can fix the things that get people there, we're going to continue to find ourselves in this cycle that folks find themselves in. And so all of that to say that there is now a much broader recognition in investing in the systems that are failing and broken. And I would also kind of follow that up by saying that there is this notion that we are compartmentalized, that conservatives want one thing and liberals want another thing and law enforcement want something and prosecutors, when actually we all want to live in healthy, safe communities. And so some of this is really just getting at what folks think keep them safe and recognizing that for a long time we've been doing things the wrong way.
So we're about to go to Q&A. Let me ask just one more quick question, but if you have questions, get ready. DeRay, so the way Marissa started to describe it, I suspect that all of your ideas for reforming the criminal justice system now are pretty much what everybody agrees on, right? You've seen tons of public support for all of your movements, right?
Yeah, I'd say what's interesting is that after 2014, after the protests, the first set of polls that came out showed that for the first time, a majority of white people actually believed in structural racism, which was a big win. What is also interesting is that this is actually the first year ever where black people are more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence, which is sort of interesting. We never thought that would happen. It had always been close, but we didn't think that we'd reach a point so quickly where black people were more afraid of being killed by an officer. I would just thread something. We talked about technology, always interested in the way that we invest in solutions that the data doesn't change and we still invest. And it's interesting being in rooms with business people who are all about the bottom line. And it's interesting when you think about policing, because in Baltimore, for instance, we put $500 million, literally $500 million to the police department. And we think about this conversation about how we define the terms that we talked about. And you think about what does it mean to solve a crime. In the United States, when police departments solve crimes, that is always just a proxy for an arrest happened. It's not a proxy for a conviction. It's not a proxy for arrested the right person. So you think about a city like Baltimore where 20% of the fatal shootings are solved. That's a bad investment. That $500 million and you only arrested one person in 20% of the cases and not even the right person? The question becomes where do we put the money? It is in other resources. And I just end with Bruce, is that Bruce, we talk about the Sharkey study all the time as a really good example. What this study showed, and Bruce knows it better than I do, is that we saw an increase in nonprofits that served people actually led to a decrease in crime. And it's one of those reminders that the investment in poverty and the end of addiction and homelessness is a little bit longer term than people. And Marissa, I think you're right that people, this question of what does it mean to feel safe is a real thing for people. But we remind people all the time, the safest neighborhoods are not the neighborhoods with the most police, they're the neighborhoods with the most resources.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
And with that, let's go to Q&A. I can't see, for what it's worth. Oh, I see James Foreman, whose book was called out. So, James, go ahead. Stand up, please. And I think someone's going to bring you a microphone.
I just want to ask a question that seems like gets at some of the, I don't know if it's like the bipartisan or this idea that there's this moment of agreement. Because what I'm struggling with is what I heard from DeRay and a number of panelists was that if we're going to make communities safe, we need a much greater investment in nonprofits, in mental health treatment, in addiction services, in fighting poverty. And all of that's expensive. And so what I'm trying to figure out is there actual agreement on funding the things that we know we're going to need to make communities safe? Because if there is an agreement on that, if there's not agreement on that, then it feels like we don't have agreement on a fundamental thing that's supposedly bringing us all together.
So let me turn to Grover on that, because taxes are one way that we get money for programs.
Civil asset forfeiture is another. It doesn't make it a good idea. This is a very interesting question, and that is, why has there been this bipartisan moment on criminal justice reform? But there has been on a series of different issues, getting rid of civil asset forfeiture, looking at mens rea. You have to know you actually committed a crime. ACLU very helpful on these issues. Mandatory minimums, the ridiculous length of them, and in some cases just the existence of them. I testified when we were bringing crack cocaine down from 100-to-1 ratio down to 18-to-1 ratio. Where'd that number come from? But 18 was lower than 100. We took it. And you had the list of all the mandatory minimums in front of you. Everyone was a press conference. Every one of those was there because somebody wanted to say, I really care. And Dirty Pictures was 45 years, and treason was 5. So you wonder where they got some of these. Shooting a federal officer on an Indian reservation was 1. So they didn't make a lot of sense. But why do we have this moment? It's not the traditional bipartisanship that has given us the mess from the last 50 years, where Republicans get together to steal some money and give it to their friends, and Democrats get together to steal some money and give it to their friends, and we can all agree to steal some money and give it to our friends. Or let's all vote for pensions for ourselves, or against term limits on us. Or let's have campaign finance reform so nobody can ever challenge our sitting position. The bipartisanship that's worked has been one of principled agreement, not from the middle, but from the serious conservatives and the Van Jones serious left of center people. And what we've agreed on is a Venn diagram. For the different reasons, sometimes very different reasons, people can agree there are too many people in prison for too many crimes. And you can get together, and that's what the first step began to get. The government, police should not steal your car or your money if you haven't committed a crime. It shouldn't, civil asset forfeiture is wrong. Right and left can both agree on that. Some people might go, yes, it hurts this community more than others, and some go, it's just wrong.
But Grover,
and we can
sorry,
both
Grover,
agree.
let me interrupt. The programming that people are talking about costs money.
There are many issues on criminal justice reform. And your question is, can this one be fit into that? And the answer is, you need to make the case that you've got something that actually works. And there has been, when we've reduced the number of people in prison, Texas being the place that sort of started that, saved a lot of money, and reinvested some of that into how do you reduce crime, drug courts, and things like that. So we have had that state by state, but it's the nature. You can't go, here's my solution, everybody should agree to it. That's been tried for the last 70 years, and it doesn't work. What you want to do is say, what's the problem? Do people see a way to fix it? And it's the principled left-right coalition against, frankly, the middle, against the guys who the people who brought us 100-to-1 ratios on crack cocaine. Okay,
Grover,
it was not the hard left or the hard right that thought that one up.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off just because I do want to get more audience participation. The woman here in the mustard sweater.
Good morning, Roberta Meyers from Legal Action Center. So just to quickly comment, it is not more costly to provide treatment for addiction and mental health care than incarcerating people indefinitely. Way cheaper, way cheaper. So it's a reallocation of funds that we already have. We have the money to do what we need to do. We just need to make the decision to do it the way it needs to be done. One thing that I think is kind of missing from the discussion, and I think it's come up in the context of all the different ways that racism has played a factor in the functioning of the legal system. We have to continue to think about and talk about what happens, not just at the point of arrest, but prosecutorial discretion and actions. And thank you, Vera. Vera's been trying to handle that and really dig into the black box that Bruce talked about. But I'm interested to hear more about people's thoughts about prosecutor action.
Okay. Let me turn to Chuck, because police like to blame the prosecutors.
You're doggone right. That's right. It's all the prosecutor.
So go ahead, Chuck.
Now, well, it's the entire system that really does need to be addressed. It's not just about police. Police, believe me, have more than enough need for reform, but it's also prosecutors, courts. The entire system needs to be reformed. But getting back to this whole issue of money, I think we could do a much better job of educating the public in terms of alternatives to incarceration that need to be supported, need to be funded, and the fact that their safety isn't jeopardized just because a person isn't going to jail. And I think that's a big problem, is how do you educate people? Because, listen, we can find money for anything else. We can find money for this if we really want to. But politicians don't get elected by saying, I want to put fewer people in jail. I want to put them back out in the neighborhoods that they come from, you know, for treatment and blah, blah, blah. You know, being tough on crime still sells in the political world. So we've got to convince the public that is not what we need to do. Now, there are some folks that do need to go to jail, but majority of people, there could be alternatives to incarceration. There's a lot of research. It needs to be understandable so people understand what the hell it is and what works and what doesn't work, right? But if we can sell the public, we can start to get the money and we can start putting these programs into reality as opposed to just discussion.
Okay. So I know that Marissa, Colette, and Alice all have something to say. As quickly as you can so that we can get to another question, but go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Marissa, sorry.
Just to Roberta's point about prosecutors, and the other group that we haven't really spent time talking about is indigent defense, public defenders. And how many criminal defense lawyers here? Yay, that's right. And the reason why I mention it is because this issue around prosecutorial, that our system is adversarial on purpose. The prosecutor is an adversary to the defendant. And so when you think about the role of the prosecutor and how much power they have from charging through sentencing, and we think that judges have a role in sentencing, not really if you get down to the nitty-gritty of this. So when we think about objective parties, folks that are not supposed to be adversarial to the interests of either the community or the defendant, we should be restoring power to judges and giving prosecutors and putting prosecutors and criminal defense lawyers in a better posture to be more adversarial and on the same level than giving prosecutors the kind of power they have now.
Great.
Thank
Colette?
you. I'd love to speak to your first point. You're absolutely right. We're already spending the money. I run a $2 billion organization to supervise 15,000 people. I have become the de facto mental health hospital in the state of Oregon and the largest alcohol and drug treatment provider in the state of Oregon. As a former victims advocate, imagine if we had spent those dollars on the front end and they were provided with those resources before they created a victim.
Alice?
I have to speak to the role of a prosecutor too. Prior to the trial, during the trial, and after trial, post-release, because I'm still feeling the effects of a prosecutor who does not want to see me come off of probation. Probation, even though my probation officer has highly recommended that I come off of probation, that role of authority is still put back in the hands of the prosecutor, even though I had 21 years of clear conduct. I've had in prison no incident reports. I've come out and my probation officer says that she wished she had at least 100 more Alice Johnsons on her caseload because I don't require supervision. Actually, the public supervises me because I'm everywhere. But the role of the prosecutor after a person is released, this is ridiculous to me, where a prosecutor should even have a say into whether or not a person comes off of probation.
I see a question right here at table 18.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, Katie Monroe from Healing Justice. I'm curious about the panel's thinking about involving crime victims and survivors in these conversations, both at the state and the federal level. I am the family member of someone who went to prison and spent pretty much all my career working with prisoners and returning citizens. But in recent years, I've been working more directly with crime victims and survivors, and I feel like you have a pretty powerful, certainly important stakeholders and probably powerful allies in these conversations, because crime victims and survivors are interested in any reforms that would lead to the prevention of crime, right? Generally, they don't want crime to happen to anyone else. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on involving more crime victims and survivors as directly impacted people. Thank you.
Louis, take this on as someone who was both a victim and someone who had committed a crime.
Yeah, sure. So I'll address that, within my professional capacity. I direct what we call our Empathy Network. The Empathy Network is the largest bipartisan coalition of advocates and organizers in the nation. And the Empathy Network comprises of 3 people within 3 specific foci. Number 1, those who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. Number 2, people who are in substance abuse recovery. And number 3, people who are survivors of crimes. And so I'm literally on an empathy tour. I've visited states by which I didn't even realize that Oregon was literally all across the other end of the country recently, right? I slept through geography. However, we've been going into spaces literally leveraging the Redemption Project, bringing survivors of violence together with those people who are offenders, with those people who are in substance abuse recovery, with those people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And the conversation and the outcomes have literally been magical. So from that perspective, one of the things that we believe at Cut 50, and we believe how we are going to continue to sustain bipartisan support, is basically having all voices who have been impacted by the criminal justice system at every point in the spectrum involved in the conversation, so that we can continue to do the great work that we're doing.
Wonderful. So let's take a moment and thank Grover, Louis, DeRay, Chuck, Bruce, Colette, Marissa, and Alice for a wonderful panel today.